We begin with that breaking news from the Supreme Court. The justices upheld the ban on TikTok, ruling the divest or ban law does not violate the First Amendment. That ban is scheduled to go into effect on Sunday. Let's take a look at just some of what Justice Neil Gorsuch said in his opinion on the ruling. He said in part, quote, "Whether this law will succeed in achieving its ends, I do not know. But the question we face today is not the law's wisdom, only its constitutionality. Given just a handful of days after oral argument to issue an opinion, I cannot profess the kind of certainty I would like to have about the arguments and record before us. All I can say is that at this time and under these constraints, the problem appears real and the response to it not unconstitutional." Now, Attorney General Merrick Garland also weighed on this, saying, quote, "Authoritarian regimes should not have unfettered access to millions of Americans' sensitive data. The court's decision affirms that this act protects the national security of the United States in a manner that is consistent with the Constitution." Lawmakers on Capitol Hill making their voices heard as well. Moments ago, our cameras caught this moment from Senator Rand Paul. Let's take a listen.
I think it's a terrible idea to ban them from using it. And essentially it is a ban. They say, oh, it's not a ban, it's just a restriction. No, if you have like a company worth $100 billion and you say you got 2 days to sell your company or even 6 months, or then you threaten them with other things, oh, well, we'll say it's antitrust if Facebook wants to buy it or somebody else. So there's not that many people with $100 billion sitting around. It's a terrible idea to do this. It's a terrible precedent to say we're going to shut down on speech. Some people say, oh, well, China bans apps. Yeah, they're an authoritarian country. That's why we're not China. We should not be banning speech. Terrible decision.
CBS News Supreme Court reporter Catherine Cole joins us now with more on all of this. We heard some of that opinion, Catherine, about how the Supreme Court approached this decision. So what does it tell you?
Yeah, you pulled out a quote from Justice Gorsuch. So Justice Gorsuch wrote a separate opinion saying, I agree with the bottom line of the court here. And that's all 9 justices. They're speaking with one voice here. This law is constitutional. Justice Gorsuch wrote separately to really spotlight a couple things. And I think what I'm picking up there is his caution here, right? He's saying this has been expedited because of that January 19th sunset deadline for TikTok. And so we haven't had a lot of time to really look at this. The more cautious approach here is to say that the law is constitutional, that for the court to say there's a massive First Amendment problem here, Congress's judgment, we can't trust that. That would be seen, I think, to people like Justice Gorsuch as significant judicial intervention, and he's loath to do that. And I think especially given the nature of this law and how it was passed, this was a bipartisan bill. 79 members of the U.S. Senate, over 300 members of the U.S. House said TikTok poses real national security concerns. And the Supreme Court said we defer to that judgment because, 1, Congress has the right to make that judgment, and 2, there aren't free speech concerns here that override that judgment.
And we also understand, Catherine, that, as you mentioned, this was a unanimous decision from the justices. How often do we see the justices defer to the laws of Congress? Is there precedent for this?
Oh, absolutely. The court speaks unanimously more often than you'd think. It's often in the really controversial cases where you see some of those splits. But one thing here, this is a First Amendment national security. That's the axis that we're on in this case, and that doesn't neatly fit into a partisan lens, so to speak. And so I'm not surprised to see a 9-0 decision here. Even in the court below, the court that considered this case before the Supreme Court, that decision was also unanimous, and that was a court with Republican-appointed and Democrat-appointed judges. Pretty much every judicial mind that has had a chance to look at this law says this is constitutional. You might not like it. You might think that TikTok's a great app and every American should have it, but Congress has the right to force divestiture, and Congress exercised that right, and that's really as far as we can go here in the judiciary.
And Catherine, we know the app is not going to go black on Sunday. Can you walk us through what happens once President-elect Trump takes office on Monday? What are his options?
So I think what it will come down to is enforcement. That's one of the things that Trump has some control over. So if service providers, if the App Store, if they do nothing to prevent users from accessing TikTok, President Trump's DOJ perhaps might just let that happen, say we're not going to enforce this. But he also has more assertive options he can take. He recently met with the CEO of TikTok, and it's possible he could try and, say, pass an executive order if he thought there was wiggle room for that. Or perhaps the most assertive move he could make would be to talk with Congress and to assert his political leverage to talk about repealing or in some way modifying this law that Congress passed last spring. But we'll see. I mean, I think it's a really open question what happens to TikTok. Yeah.
All right, Catherine Cole, thanks so much for breaking that down for us.